packed together than we do on our own. That's okay. We'll just get to that. The theme this month is soil care and composting. And this week's guest is Mike Dorian from Living Soil Solutions here in Calgary. We record these sessions, which you just heard start, and they are available afterwards on the SOIL website, which is theorganiclandcare.ca. On the website, that's also where you can see the upcoming monthly themes and the weekly guests. So please share this widely with your networks. And if you have a topic you'd like to hear, please let us know, and we can add that to our list of topics. Now, before I introduce our special guest here, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge where we are coming to you from. I'm coming from High River, Alberta, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the first people of Southern Alberta, including the Siksika, Piikani, Kiani, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So, without further ado, as I said before, our guest today is Mike Dorian, owner of Living Soil Solutions in Calgary and part of the High Fuel Regenerative Farm, also here in Calgary. Originally from Red Deer, he got his start with the permaculture certificate, something else we have in common, and has grown into a force to be reckoned with, I will say. But at any rate, I'll throw it over to you, Mike. I'll let you fill in any blanks, and then you can get going.
Perfect. Thank you.
So
the permaculture design certificate kind of took me on the whirlwind, as it seems to do for a lot of people, where it's like, oh, I just learned a whole bunch. I should probably learn more and more and more. And I ended up falling into a soil course later that fall, and that took me to the next level, and kind of put out the feelers of starting the business that next spring, and lo and behold, that spring I got a few phone calls, so I had to get started, and that's where Living Soil started. So that's kind of the basis of me. I could talk about other stuff, but we've got a short period of time here, so I'm going to run into some things here. And can you give me the ability to share my screen, please, Nick? And I figure because it is Compost Awareness Week, I thought it would be a good point to talk about compost and the ways that we can use that to build up our soil, but also a way to give back to it.
Oh, okay. Mike, sorry to interrupt. I'm just looking at technical difficulties. I think somehow, Christine, if you're on here, you've become host. If you could make Mike host.
Oh, she's hosting.
Yeah, Christine is part of our crew. Christine, are you there?
Yeah, hi, I'm here, but I'm curious to know why I'm host, but I didn't
I
sign
am
in.
too. I made Mike host, and now for some reason it says you're host. And
I know, and I'm on the button.
Nick,
Yes.
It's Astrid here.
Yes,
Nick,
hi.
it's Astrid here. I'm going to reclaim host, and then I'm going to make Nick host.
Mike.
Mike.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. No, that's awesome. See, this is why we work as a team.
We work as a team. So now I'm making. Okay, I have to make Mike host now. Make host. Okay. Yes, Mike, I'm making you host. Good.
Nice.
You're host
Okay.
now, and you can share your screen.
Thanks for that. Sorry.
Beautiful. No worries. Okay. Get you out of the way. Boop, boop. Okay. All right. Let's talk about compost. You guys can all see that okay? Give me a thumbs up. Perfect. All right. Now, the fun thing about compost, especially if you're making it your own or you're purchasing it, a rotted pile of horse manure is still a rotted pile of horse manure. So compost is tipping. We're checking things and keeping an eye on it and making sure that there's certain levels that we want to reach to make sure that we are getting a product that we really want to put back to the soil to get to where we want to go. Now, quality compost is all about the life. We want to make sure that it's alive. I have come across a few companies that sell compost, is what they call it, but they sterilize it before they sell it. Well, that tells me that that's not compost. That is just organic matter, which is still good, but compost has its benefit of changing the microbial side of the life in the soil and just adding more organic matter. So is how we take probiotics and use those kinds of things to build up our microbiome to help us digest our food. Those organisms in the soil are actually helping digest those nutrients and make them water soluble and available for the plant to actually put to use as well. Because typically we have a lot of nutrient and mineral in the soil, but it's just not available because that's the microbes' jobs. That's what they're supposed to do. So we have to start to switch from this mind frame of feeding the plant, and then we eat the plant, where we should be feeding the soil, and the soil will feed the plant, and then the plant will feed us. So just a couple of examples, if looking under a microscope, just if we wanted some technical people out there, under the microscope, this is something really good to see if we're looking for the fungal side of the stuff in our soil or in our compost. So to decipher this from just basic roots in the soil, you'll see little notches, these little notches here. Well, those are what are called septae, and that's how fungi grows in sections. That's a really simple way for us to look at it and go, okay, I've got some fungal biology here. And if we were able to zoom in and out, if this was a video, we'd be able to see about 5 or 6 different strands of fungal hyphae, which means, boom, we've got some good diversity there. So we'd be very happy with that. And then to get kind of a really good scope with a whole bunch of life in there, so all these like little dots here, a lot of these are little bacteria. So you can see how if we have really healthy soil, there's tons and tons of them in there. And we've got some predators in here as well. So we've got an amoeba. So that one's naked. We just caught it getting out of the shower. Ah, where's my towel? Right? So those guys are going around munching down on all those bacteria, which have become like little bags of fertilizer, and now eating what they need for their metabolic process and pooping the rest out in a form that's now soluble. And this here is up here is called a teste amoeba. So what that means is the conditions for this amoeba might not have just been right, whether it's pH or temperature or moisture levels, and it's been able to take itself into a little shell and hibernate and go into dormancy there until it's ready to come back out again and start eating. And then this big old creature over here, this is a bacterial feeding nematode. So again, they're going and just mowing down on all these little predator or little prey and eating them, taking what they need for the metabolic process again and putting the rest out in a form that's soluble for the plants. So nature has already figured out this way of cycling our nutrients. And if we learn to work with it and manage it properly, then we're going to have way better results working within those natural systems. And that's where coming into working with compost becomes a big part of that. So essentially, we're taking like what happens at a forest, right? If we look at a forest, does anybody fertilize a forest? Does anybody water a forest? So that system has been able to take care of itself. So what's happening there? We got lots of diversity. There's tons of different plants growing in different heights and levels and ground. And so they all have different root depths. Some are going laterally, some are deep, some are spreading out really all over the place. You've got very little disturbance. Nobody's going into a forest and raking all the leaves away, right? All that stuff is falling back to the forest floor and being able to rot back to the system. We have typically a lot of perennials within that system too, so that we've got roots that are constantly in that soil. And then that soil is covered majority of the time. So we're protecting the soil from the outside elements and whatever else can affect it. So by composting, we're taking that kind of process a little bit into our own hands. And if we do it, key word here is aerobically, making sure that we have lots of oxygen, because oxygen is key, because we can compost things anaerobically, but those are special processes that then we want to take that end product and do something a little different to it before we put it to use. So aerobic means oxygen loving or lots of oxygen. Anaerobic means very little oxygen or oxygen hating. So we want to make sure that things are aerobic. So, oh, it looks like this slide. So what that says there is we take away, sorry, it looks like it went, can you guys see the writing at the top? Okay, no, okay, so it's just out of the screen, sorry about that. So we take away, so we're taking these beautiful tomatoes away from us. And when we do something like that, we need to give back. So this is that you know, people when they start their garden the first year or the second year, they have these great results. But then if you're growing these veggies and all that energy is going up into that food and you take it away, we got to give back every time. That's that force. It's never not giving back. It's always cyclical, right? So we need to do something similar. And that's where compost is one of the easiest ways to do that. Okay, so, oh, we skipped a few here. Okay, so again, it's all about the life. So we want to make sure that that life is there. And then when we're making our compost, all the different ingredients that we add to it are going to give us that much more diversity. So the more diversity, the higher chance we have all these different organisms that are going to be able to work within our soil and then be able to work with the plants that we're growing. Okay, so the bonus of this is to make sure that we're building up the resiliency of our soil, right? So we're providing more food, we're helping increase that structure, we're adding more diversity of organisms, which are going to help with competition of keeping pathogens and pests away, right? And then as we increase that structure, we're going to have a better chance of holding more water and actually having it flow through the system better and actually hold the nutrients in place for longer as well. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. So we'll go on to the basic gist of how to make compost, and then, you know, if we have time, we can talk about the different styles of composting. So I like to look at it as like making a soup, right? Typically, when we start going with something like this, we want to you know, follow a recipe to start until we get comfortable with it, and then you can start to tweak it, right? Like, ooh, I like it a little spicier, or like, I want more potatoes in that. So then you start adding and changing your things as you become more comfortable with it. We want to make sure that we're kind of following that soup there. Now, it goes into a couple different recipes or ingredients. You gonna go for me, screen? Okay, doesn't want to switch on me here. Oh, there we go. Cool. Okay, so our first ingredient, this is going to be oxygen. So again, as I was talking about the aerobic side, we want to make sure that there's lots of oxygen flowing through this system, okay? So we don't want things to get matted or too wet and taking up those air spaces. The other one is water. We need a certain amount of moisture because the microbes are the ones, they need that moisture and able to process. So we want to make sure that it's a certain moisture level. If it's too dry, the microbes aren't going to do anything. If it's too wet, then it's not going to have enough oxygen, and we're going to start working with anaerobic materials instead of aerobic materials. Well, it looks like somebody's phone's going, and maybe there's another mute on there.
Yes.
So whoever's on not on mute, do you mind taking it off, please? And then with the water, we want to focus on using hopefully rainwater as much as possible. What do we got there? Let's see if we can find out who that is.
Are you still looking for a doctor or a nurse practitioner in your community?
I have a nurse practitioner assigned since my son was born in 2020,
Mike?
October 2020.
Yeah.
Your host, you could mute Catalina.
Yeah. How do you Oh, there we go.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Thanks for taking my call. Have a good day.
Bye, you too.
Bye.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think I got that there. Anyway, so then water, we want to try to use rainwater as much as possible. It's the cleanest water system that we have. If you are using water from the city, when it's got chloramine or chlorine in it, we want to try to isolate that or let it gas off or bubble it, or we can use humic or acids added into that water to help tie up that chlorine. Because as that stuff starts to build up into our soil, even in our compost, it's a salt base, so that can start to affect and pull moisture away from our organisms and our plants. Okay. Wow. All right, then our next ingredient is what typically most people call greens, but I like to call it what it is for nitrogen, because if we look at what it's actually feeding, so it's feeding the bacteria, and bacteria like to eat the high nitrogen sources, then we can have an idea of what we're affecting or what we're feeding in our compost pile. So these are going to be all those really juicy green, usually have a lot of moisture items into it. And so like we're looking at our food waste, fresh cut grasses, hay, alfalfa, any of our manures, and then coffee grounds is a really good one to use also in our cities if you don't have good access to the manures. And another really good one too is the spent grains from breweries. There's so many breweries set up nowadays, and they're all trying to get rid of it. So it's really easy to just knock on the door and go take a couple of buckets to the back, and they always have tons out there to use. So that's a really great nitrogen source. And then the other ones is our browns, which I like to call carbon, because the carbon is what typically feeds our fungal biology. So then we have an idea of what is eating our sources there. So these are going to be more of our tougher, woodier, ligniny kind of materials. So we're looking at straw, paper or cardboard we could use. We can use wood chips, sawdust, that kind of stuff. Dried leaves is a really good one as well. So these are, so the bonus with the carbon is it's going to help hold a lot more moisture in the pile, but it's also the bulkier stuff. So it's going to also help create some of those air spaces so that our pile still stays aerobic. Now, there's a couple different ways we can go about this. My favorite one is the one here in the middle, is having an active pile. So where we're actively mixing it and we're putting a thermometer in there and we're tracking the temperature range to make sure that we're getting to that pattern of temperature that we want to get to. We're taking care of weed seeds and pathogens, kind of pasteurizing the bad guys, if you could say. And then that way, then we're flipping the outside to the in, the inside to the out, and we're getting all parts of that up to that temperature. And we can process it very fast. I've seen some community gardens that I've worked with take all their bulk material, so you can still tell that it's food waste and whatnot, and make it look like compost within a 2-week period. Now you could put that to use, like mellow it out with some other material, but then I like to take that compost and then put it aside, carp it off for a little bit, and let it sit for anywhere from 2 to like 4, maybe 6 months. And that's when now you're going to allow the fungal biology to be able to build up and start to eat at some of the carbon that's left in that pile, because that's typically what we're missing in our soils, is the fungal component. So if we can make sure that we grow and build really good compost that has a good diversity of fungal biology in it, then we're going to be able to replace those and build that back up in our soils. Now, the other one here is this like Darth Vader helmet looking thing here. These are pretty common ones to be used for passive composting. Now, you could set temperature in a passive compost as well, but not in these bins here because they're too small. You need a certain amount of mass, typically about 1 meter by meter. That's why a lot of people build their bins for the active piles like using pallets, because it gives you kind of that meter by meter dimensions. So then you have enough mass to hold that temperature. These passive ones, any kind of bin style like this, you're typically just, you're mimicking what's happening in a forest. You're creating your ratios of browns to greens, your carbon to nitrogen, making sure there's enough moisture, and then just letting it sit. So, this is going to take anywhere from 1 year to 1.5 years, depending on how well you keep managing the moisture levels. But then you should be able to scoop stuff from the bottom. There is fancier ways that you can take this style and actively add oxygen to it. So I've seen people make a bin like this and then hook up like a leaf blower with a tube that goes through it. And then that tube's got little holes in it, and then they blast the leaf blower through it, and it's actively aerating now that pile. So that's ways of playing around with that. Some people have just stuck tubes in it and with holes in it, and that can help as well. So it just depends on how fancy you want to make it and how much time you have to deal with it and how fast you want that end product as well, right? So being active, you're definitely going to be getting a lot quicker. If you want to do the lazy man's way, passive is the way to go. And then the third one is typically called cold composting or what's called vermicomposting. So this is where we're taking those microbes that are in the other two as well, but now we're actively adding worms that are specifically really good at just eating food at the kind of top levels of the soil if they were still in their native environment. So red wigglers are the most common type of worm used for that. And they're really good at just mowing down any kind of organic material and then putting it out on the back end as worm castings or worm poop. So we're essentially harvesting the poop and really, really good diversity there of organisms that we can put back in. This is becoming definitely a lot more popular as people are living more and more in condos and apartments and don't have yards or access to build a compost pile somewhere, because you're not going to build a compost pile in your living room. Well, maybe not all of us. There's a few of us, I think, that probably has. I see Nick nodding his head there for sure. And but you know, the worms we could easily have in a Rubbermaid or make a fancy little thing, and we could do something like that in our house, right? So it makes it a lot simpler. So let's talk a little bit. So feedstocks. So you want to kind of look at, okay, what do I have available in my yard? You know, do I have a big deciduous tree that drops a certain amount of leaves every year? Do I cut the grass and I have those grass clippings? Is there a coffee store down the way? Do I have a friend that's a farmer that might be able to bring me some manures into town, right? Figure out what kind of resources you have and then go, okay, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this, but I'm missing this. Where do I, and then where can I find that? So then you can start doing some searching for that. We all have food waste. It's pretty easy to find the dried leaves. There's no excuses to find coffee grains or sorry, yeah, the coffee grains or even the spent grains from the breweries, because there's so many of them now. And then if our last resource is to find a farmer with some manure, then so be it. And as some of these cities like Calgary is finally starting to get a little progressive in allowing backyard chickens, well, hey, those people, maybe they're not going to be compost experts. So grab that manure. It's going to be really great stuff to use. And then don't get too strung up on this. This sometimes becomes a concept that, you know, some people have a hard time wrapping their head around. But let's just say, so we're dealing with organic material, so things that are living or were living at one point or are part of the living system. They all have carbon and nitrogen in them. So when we start looking at a carbon to nitrogen ratio, so everything's going to have the nitrogen, and then as it gets more complex, we're going to have more branches of carbon coming off of one nitrogen molecule. So this is where we look at, so let's look at it up here. So like our chicken manure. So we have one nitrogen molecule with 5 carbons attached to that. So that would be looked at as a very high nitrogen source. So that's going to really help us bring the fire or the heat to our compost pile. And then as we start to get more complex, looking up into the areas of the oats and the straw and stuff like that, right? So look at here, like our wheat straw. So that's 128 carbons to 1 nitrogen. So that's going to be a ton of these carbons branched off that 1 nitrogen molecule. So that's very complex. So we need the fungi to work and eat on that. So that shows you where the carbon is compared to the nitrogen. So when we're looking, we want to try to have a ratio of a certain amount. So for example, I like to do kind of a 40% nitrogen for my pile to a 60% carbon. So I'll figure out those feedstocks that I have. Okay, so I've got leaves, I've got a little bit of wood mulch, I've got some coffee grounds, I've got some grass, and I've got some food waste. And I would break those down into my ratios of, okay, I'm going to need 60% of that to be my leaves and my wood chips, and the rest is going to be comprised of my food waste, my coffee grounds, and that cut grass, right? So we start to figure out what kind of material we have, what category does it fit in? Does it fit into high nitrogen, nitrogen, or carbon? And then we can start to make our recipe. And like this little list here off to the right, you can easily just Google like carbon and nitrogen ratio scales, and there's tons that'll come up so that it can give you an idea of what you have and where it sits. And there, if you're a total numbers person, there is mathematical equations that you can punch all these in and then figure out what your end ratio is with all your ingredients mixed together. But I don't like to do that. I just like to make the pile. It's way easier to do it that way. Okay, so this is how I break them down. So our groups are carbon. Okay, so carbon is our woodier materials. So that's the stuff that's going to be our bulking agents and a lot harder to break down. So that's where the fungal comes in. So that's the break for the system. The nitrogen is going to be our food waste and kind of older
Learning about
material and that kind of thing. Oh, we got somebody chatting. Can we get somebody to mute theirs, please?
I think it's Catalina. If you could mute your line, please.
Cool.
You're on there.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
No worries. The nitrogen is really good for creating some heat, but it's also good at just holding that heat. And then the real high nitrogen, so that's stuff that's going to be in that single digit of carbon to nitrogen ratios, like our manures and the coffee grounds. That's what really produces the gas and the heat for our compost pile. So it's always really important to have a certain percentage of that, really get the thing cooking. And I always find it easier if you're still unsure when you're making it, make it a little bit higher carbon to start with, because it's going to be way easier to add a little bit of nitrogen to get it cooking than a whole ton of carbon to kind of slow it down. Okay, all right. Oh, it's not going through here. Okay. On here. Okay, so why this is important is just the fact that if you look at what's going on above soil, it's telling the story of what's going on below the soil. So this is a slide that showcases succession. So if we looked at our soil and it was very highly bacterial, this is where we're starting to get a lot of our weeds and stuff showing up, because the weeds are a successional plant. They usually pop up to help pull mineral up from the subsoils. They're usually trying to grow and die really fast to build up biomass and organic matter on the top part of the surface and prep the soil for the next succession of plants, right? So as we start to build up our fungal biology in the soil with the structure increasing, then this is where we kind of sit the best in the middle for most of the plants that we want to grow to eat or that we're growing for cover crops and big egg. We want to kind of have that balance of bacteria to fungal within the soil. So this is where we can get really good at dialing in how we make our compost piles, that we can change this instead of letting nature do its thing over 500 to 1,000 years. We can take our little backyard and speed fast that succession with making our compost a lot more fungal. And then as we move into the deciduous and the woodier species and into the conifers there, that's where the soil becomes a lot more fungally dominated. So realize this now, that when, if you've got a tree growing in your yard and grass is growing up to the base of that tree, these are two different plant systems that want different soil types. They're actually going to compete against each other. And if that tree is just newly planted or it's had a couple stressful years, that grass can take it out or cause it to get sick and slow its growth process. So that's why we always want to mulch out our trees with wood or grow other plants underneath that tree that would typically be in that forest system with it. Okay, so just a really kind of neat little side thing. I could talk about the succession quite a bit, but I'm sure we're going to have some questions that we're going to want to rock and roll on too. Okay. Come on, Mr. Slide. It's really reacting slow. It's interesting. We can go faster this way. So when figuring out what style you want to do, it's going to come down to figuring out, okay, do I have space to store a bunch of compost, or, you know, am I going to be more inclined to do something like a vermicompost bin because it's a lot simpler and easier? And then the other one is going to be ability. Right? Do you have the strength to get in there, or, you know, or do you get a young grand lad or grandson or granddaughter that can get in there and help you out if you're a little bit on the older side, right? Get those kids working for you, or try to find some compost buddies and work together on this. The community composting, I think, model is something that's going to change our community spaces going forward. Like, if we can start processing our own waste within our communities and then turning around and growing food in our own communities, holy moly, we're going to make some big things happen. So that there, so we kind of went on the basis of all the different types. We could dive into the active one a little bit more. So maybe I'll just touch on it really quick, and then we can finish up with some questions. So if we want to get active, what you're going to mainly need is you're going to need that space. You're going to want to have a thermometer. So Lee Valley is pretty good at selling the smaller ones. If you want to get a bigger one, they're called Rio Temp. You can get up to 3 to 4 to 5 foot long ones. And then you're going to want a pitchfork or something you're going to be able to use to toss and tear that compost pile apart. Now, the idea is we want to get it up to a certain temperature. So in that middle, in that core of that compost pile, we want to try to get it up into that kind of 55 to 70 degree range. We don't want to go any higher. We want to make sure we get past the 55, because that is when the pathogens and the weed seeds get terminated. But then, as you see on the outsides, it's not as high, right? Like, we're still sitting at, 30 degrees. The ambient temperature is looking at about 22. So that's why we want to turn it, because we got it up to that temperature. Now we want to take that heat, pull it out to the outsides, and get that outside back into the middle. So now it has a chance to go up to that heat, and then we cycle that. And typically they say anywhere from 4 to 5 turns, you should be able to get all parts of that compost pile get through that high temperature process, and then you're happening. So this is kind of a cool slide that shows kind of just the scale of it. So we built that pile, boom, it went up to that temperature. So we turned it, so it dropped a little bit, boom, it went up, it dropped again, boom, it went up. And now we start to see that it's starting to space out. So it's not heating up as fast. And then once we get that one last turn, it went and it tried to go for it. And then it became that little train that couldn't, and then went all the way back down the mountain. So that's when we get to that point where it's like, okay, we're good here. Now we're back to ambient temperature. Now we can put it aside to cure and let the fungal start to do its thing and develop in that pile. Because that's the key thing with fungal too, is it's very delicate. So if we start to mess with our soils too much by, rototilling or heavy compaction, even having it exposed to wind and sun and heavy waters, we can take the fungal out very quickly. So then that soil becomes highly bacterial again, and then boom, the weeds start showing up, and those weed seeds start germinating. This is just a different one where the compost pile was a lot more fungally dominated, so it was a lot more carbon in it. So it didn't heat up as many times because there wasn't as much nitrogen. So this is the way I prefer to do it, just because we're looking to replace that fungal back into that pile. So another way, so when we're done, we want to look, you want to smell, you could listen a little bit, I guess. You want to see if little critters and stuff are going, but use the compost thermometer to tell us that the temperature is good. And then when you're feeling it, it should almost have a little bit of a greasy feel to it. And what that is, like feeling almost like clay, that's that humus. That's that stable material of carbon that's going to be sitting now into our soil. That's like a magnet of holding water and nutrients in place. So that's kind of that ultimate goal of what we're trying to get to in our soil. So if we can get that in our compost and get that into the soil that way, then we're fighting that battle on both ends, which is a bonus to get us to where we want to go. And then, yeah, there's just a bunch of different styles that you can do these. You can, make fancy ones. You can use straw bales. You can use push, the wire mesh. in little circles or on a pallet. This is some of those aerobic ones that I was talking about with the passive style. So just the tubes going down through the middle or down through the bottoms. And then guys hooking things up to actively blow air into the piles. This is pretty common in some of the larger facilities, but instead of blowing the air in, they're actually sucking it. So now they're pulling that odor with it too, and then being able to run it through like a biofilter or something, just because the larger operations definitely have a lot of mass there. You could have an odor issue very quickly. And then just other funny ones like rollers and tumblers. And this is a fancy one that we're going to build at the farm here. It's called a Johnson Sioux bioreactor. So this guy has figured out this way of making a certain recipe within this certain style and having it aerated with these, but then a drip hose on top, so it's slowly dripping water with it, and then you're gathering the leachate at the bottom. And he has you do it for over a year, and he's actually put, the end product through a DNA analysis, and it's gotten a breakdown of all the microbes that are present within that. So it's really starting to get geeky into the next level, that's for sure. And then just the passive stuff that just goes on for time and space. So just the containers I had talked about earlier, so nothing too fancy. And then the vermicomposting one. So the vermicomposting is pretty similar to the active piles making it, but just where the carbon, we start to call the carbon bedding instead. And the bedding part is very, very important when vermicomposting. It helps mitigate our moisture levels. But also then as that starts to break down, it becomes a food source for the worms as well, which then also helps feed the fungal component. And then the only thing we have to remember with the worms is they can't be done like in freezing temperatures or get too hot, because the worms, they're a bit finicky. And then, yeah, just little tips and stuff, like the smaller your items are, the faster they're going to process. I like to go around and pick a bunch of different weeds of different plants and throw those in, because each one of those weeds is going to be working with a different type of biology. So that's diversity, diversity, diversity. If you know somebody that's made a really good pile, or if you've got some good worm castings or something, throw a little bit of that in. That's going to inoculate more diversity of organisms. When you're adding moisture and your pile is already hot, try to warm the water up a little bit, because then that cold water is going to cool the pile down. It'll take a little bit longer to heat up again. And I always like to name my piles, right? So for example, we get a bunch of stuff from Sunny Cider here. He gives us like apple pumice and stuff, and the owner's name is Tim. So I made that pile the Tim, and he was quite honored that I named the compost after him, right? And then keeping it covered. So because we're so dry here in Alberta, that keeps the moisture in. But then if you're in someone like BC or somewhere where you're getting a lot more rainfall, then it's keeping the moisture out, so it's not getting too saturated, right? And then just easy ways, top dress, put it around the plant, water it in, light tickle, light rake in, right? Really simple. You don't have to get too crazy and mix it all in. Make it easy on yourself. And then other ways to just take it further is doing teas and compost teas and extracts and that kind of stuff. I won't talk too much on that, because we'll go on some little questions here. And just to let you know, it is Compost Awareness Week till, oh, I did change that. I did change it. It didn't stay. But it's May 2nd, so it started on Sunday and it goes till the 7th. And so like going on compost.org is the Compost Council of Canada, and that's one of our members with the Highfield Farm. And yeah, you'll learn even more stuff about compost if I didn't cover it. So we can slide into questions. You want to help me go through that there, Nick?
Yeah, that absolutely. That was great. As a side, just as a little side note, a while ago, I was Googling something, and I Googled the compost kid, and you came up. So that's awesome, which is awesome. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
I've never Googled that. I'll have to do that again.
Yeah, no, it's great. You're famous. There was just one question here so far, and please, anyone, if you have any other questions, I have a couple here. Add it to the chat. We have time for a couple of them here. Barbara was wondering, and I was too, what power of microscope do you use to see the fungal hyphae and stuff?
Right, that's only 400 times.
400 times,
That's your eyepiece is at 10, and then just the 40.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. Microscopic, but still not that small, right?
Oh yeah, not too bad at all.
Yeah, right on. I had one question. You meant I love the give back aspect too. But the one question, whenever you're talking to people about compost, especially this time of year, and they talk about the compost being really hot, like they'll warn me sometimes, like this is really hot. And so after, does that just mean that the fungal aspect hasn't had its chance to do its job yet? Is that what they're talking about, or?
That's definitely a part of it. So when people are saying that, what that means is that compost is actually really high nitrogen.
Right.
So,
right.
For example, looking at the city of Calgary's compost, when it comes out, it's hot. So
right.
So you're not going to want to use that just on its own. You're going to want to kind of water it down, essentially using some kind of just loam or peat or something like that, just to scale it out a bit. Because the basis of that is and this is me saying that, in my opinion, I don't think it's completely ready to sell.
Right. Well, that actually, that brought me to my other part of that question was about the municipal compost and what your thoughts were about that kind of stuff. So
yeah, like it's good stuff. I just they just don't have the space or the time, and this is something that we're trying to pitch to them. Like, if you can take a certain amount, and then why don't we take a certain amount, and then we'll let it cure for a period of time to just let it mature and stabilize a little bit better.
right.
But because they don't have that, and most of the people that they're selling it to are big soil mixing companies anyway, so they are all watering it down themselves. But you know, like we did have piles dropped off last November, and they stayed up to like 50 to 60 degrees for almost 2 months.
Yeah. In the winter.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what I'm thinking there is like, okay, well, let's just get some from them. We're not going to use it for sale, but maybe let's run some piping through it and use it to suck all the heat out of it.
There you go.
So we might play around with that as kind of a substitute to heat the greenhouse.
Something like that. Yeah. Sweet.
Yeah.
Sweet. There's just one other question before we're running close to time here, but have you ever heard of the composter called the Lumi, which uses electricity? I've never.
Yeah, I have heard of that. I've been looking through the system. It sounds like a little mini version of what some of these large vessel systems are. So I don't know how well it works, because I think I'd fill the thing so bloody fast I wouldn't be ready for it. So I think those are kind of neat little systems. I'd like to order one and play with it. I don't know what else to really say about it just yet, because I haven't played with one, but
Yeah,
but I think that kind of technology, you know, mixing with kind of these natural processes, there's going to be more and more of that coming down the pipe. That's for sure.
And yeah, she just added that she's in a condo, I believe it's Barbara. Yeah, she's in a
Okay.
condo, so that might be about it. Yeah. Okay. Right
Yeah.
on. Well, something to look into. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we are just got the 45-minute mark, so thank you, Mike Dorian, for this is a great presentation. I learned, so I was taking notes the whole time, and I've been composting for a while. So it's
Awesome,
great.
man.
Oh, one thing quickly from Peter, could you quickly clarify the types of composting? I get confused with aerobic and anaerobic, hot, cold, and vermicomposting.
Yeah, so aerobic composting is pretty much most of our compost processes, as long as there's good chunkiness and airspace, so we're getting oxygen flowing through the system. Anaerobic systems, those are going to be kind of your digestive or your anaerobic digesters, or doing like the Bokashi kind of style. That's an anaerobic style of composting. And then hot compost is anything that's going to get up to temperature. So typically our active composts, or if we're doing larger passive piles and actively aerating it. And then cold composting kind of slides into the vermicomposting realm. And then passive is just essentially making your pile and letting it sit and let nature take care of it.
Right on. Well, yeah, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks again, Mike. I just want, as a closing remarks here, next week's guest is Julia Dupuy, another member of SOL, talking about soil testing, which is a super important topic for all of us gardeners, and hosted by Sundora, and that should be a great discussion. So again, thank you, Mike. If anyone has any questions, want to talk to Mike or follow along what he's up to, just there's the info there. And thank you all for coming.
Welcome.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye now.
How do I don't know how to stop recording.